Hello, everybody. I have a wonderful guest on my show. His name is Harry, and he created a really great theory called cognitive personality theory, which is very useful when it comes to personal growth. And on my other channel, we talk about its applications in regards to personality typology. And here we want to kind of extend beyond that into its broader applications as well. So, Harry, can you first kind of tell us about what is cognitive personality theory?
As a basic kind of overview, cognitive personality theory is, as the name might imply, like a cognition-based model of personality. What this essentially means is instead of saying people are extroverted or open or agreeable, like a big five kind of trait-based approach would do, it's much more saying like, how do people differ in the way they actually process information? Like, how do people, is one person naturally predisposed maybe to kind of consult their own internal kind of value system before taking action, whereas another person wants to dive into action without necessarily knowing whether they actually want that action or not in a deeper sense. So it's recognizing these natural kind of differences between people, kind of quantifying them to an extent with a framework, but also much more importantly, kind of proposing a gateway system, a system comprised of kind of gateways and pathways that kind of enables people to balance themselves out a little bit. And in many ways, like a type is sort of, to some extent, like a state of imbalance. And it's nice to kind of like to say, if I'm doing a bit of this, how do I kind of do a bit of that too, to kind of get a nice sense of balance between these two different extremes of my brain.
Right. So you're talking about like how people, yes, they naturally have a disposition with natural strengths and weaknesses, but what are ways that we could be able to work with that and change that so that the scope of what we're able to do is broader?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Some people might say like, well, how people operate is completely based off of nature and people should just use whatever their own strengths are. What is the value of being able to kind of open up these new pathways in how people behave?
Yeah, awesome. So while the system recognizes that everyone does definitely have some kind of nature, we are definitely born in a certain way. And, by the time we're kind of like we become teenagers, we've already learned to operate in a certain way as well. There's some stuff which has been embedded there into some kind of cognitive personality. But from that point, we aren't locked into this pattern. We aren't locked into suddenly being unable to think in different ways. Like all of us are human and all of us very much can think in many different ways. All of us can very much kind of expand our brains into adulthood. It's been increasingly found that adults can continuously, just almost like children can, like grow new synapses within their brain, kind of access a high level of neuroplasticity through constantly learning and challenging ourselves and just kind of expanding our horizons. But there's a lot to say for kind of seeing these ways in which we've learned to solve situations or learn to understand situations, and then kind of thinking critically about our own thought processes, taking a step back and saying, is this the most proportional way to think about this? Or is this the most proportional way to deal with this problem? Or am I making the problem worse? Maybe my natural way of thinking about things and approaching problems isn't well suited to this particular problem that's come my way. And that's why it kind of aligns with a more fluid environment, or like acquiring new things and acquiring new experiences, because maybe we have a cognition which is well suited to a life which is very kind of cyclical and doesn't really necessarily change that much. And maybe in some ways it can be good even. But if we're given new experiences, what happens then? What happens when our brain is suddenly challenged with something that it hasn't accounted for? Well, the brain has to adapt. And that's what the system's all about, really.
Right. So when you're talking about when we get kind of cyclical, it's kind of like when we get stuck in our own ways, and in a way that's relatively mindless. And you're saying like, what if we could step back in a mindful way and kind of observe ourselves? So how do you get into that state where you could step back and you can observe yourself and find a new way of approaching things in life?
Well, the really interesting thing about this is if we kind of like we're operating according to our default program or the way we've programmed ourselves, what we find is things happen and then we react to them. And there isn't actually a lot of space in between the input and the output.
Right.
So if we actually take some more space in between, if we suddenly find ourselves slowing down, we realize, actually, do we really need to do this in 5 seconds when we could do it in 15 seconds? Like, is it really that bad to lose 10 seconds of our lives to think about this a little bit more deliberately? If we create that kind of buffer between input and output, then that's when we become kind of more aware of our own thought processes. There's a term called metacognition, for example. In many ways, that's thinking about thinking. And to be metacognitive, in many ways, we do have to slow down a little bit. We do have to be more mindful, take a pause, and then say, okay, I thought about this, but have I thought about thinking about this? And that's where this comes in a bit more.
Interesting. So like in a metacognition, you're taking a pause and you're really stepping back, you're taking a look and you're reassessing things. So what's a way you find helpful in terms of doing that reassessment? Like what do you do that helps with that?
You know, what's so fascinating is there's a lot to say about the mind-body connection. Like a lot of the ways of kind of like accessing ourselves isn't just through this thing over here, it's through this entire kind of like system that it's connected to and responding to all the time. So like one of my favorite ways to achieve this state is actually to literally slow my body down, to literally move through the air and sort of render this gas that I'm moving through something more liquid. And it feels more like moving through water sometimes.
Wow.
And, you know, like you don't need to take it into a cartoonish kind of like way of like Harry moving through his room, kind of like this impossibly slow tortoise-like speed. But just slowing things down a little bit, being less jerky with our movements, for example, and being a bit looser in our bodies itself can have a profoundly metacognitive effect. Wow. Because suddenly we do become naturally aware. We're not even trying to do it. Our brain's suddenly having the time to look at itself that it wasn't given before.
That's really fascinating. Like the way we think is carried about and how we move about in the world. And you say like, and I could actually picture that, like when someone is like slowing down physically, that does something mentally because they're not like going into that automatic pattern as before.
Yeah, exactly. And as we were talking about just in the last interview, Leon, on your other channel, like everything is connected, everything's integrated, you know, and as is the body with the mind. And so becoming, you know, integrated with all of ourselves rather than just a part of ourselves or the parts that we prefer or something like that. It applies as much to the mind and body as it does to the mind and its different kind of processing centers.
Yeah. And what's interesting, so some people are more mind focused and others are more body focused. And that doesn't mean that's has to be the way that they only need to be. It's really, there's a natural tendency to want to integrate. The other side would want to call and say, hey, pay attention to me. I'm important here too.
Exactly. And, you know, focusing on the other side also frees up the first side. So like if someone who's more body oriented, thinking about mind, they suddenly realize, oh, that's what was going on. You know, it's like they feed into each other, recognizing one opposing kind of force within the mind or the body allows it to be more better integrated with its origin as well. So there's a lot of kind of holisticism involved in that kind of approach.
Yeah. And some people say, I don't have time for this. There's many different kinds of modalities. Like there's mind, body, spirit, and there's a lot of things to take care of, right? So what do you say to that? That, you know, that's a lot to pay attention to.
What's really interesting is when we slow something down or when we start paying attention to something, it might seem counterproductive, but oftentimes it can give us more attention. Like sometimes the effort that we're putting into being hyper-attentive of one thing is actually, in many ways, too much energy. It's because we're actually with this hyper-focus on one thing. Whether we know it or not, we're intentionally not focusing on something else, and intentionally not focusing on something takes energy as well. That also takes attention.
Interesting. Wow.
So essentially, there's a lot of give back from this kind of holistic approach, recognizing these different ways that we are, and these different kind of centers of the nervous system as well, allowing them to integrate with each other and paying attention to all of them. You know, it doesn't have to be like everything all at once in this big kaleidoscopic way, but just like going through it and becoming 1 second aware of that, 1 second aware of that. That gives a lot of energy back to you because you're no longer trying to push things down all the time, and that can be exhausting.
Yeah, and that's interesting because we were actually unconsciously suppressing a lot, and as a result, that causes a lot of pressure, and there's different parts of ourselves that they're asking, you know, they're calling out for us to pay attention to them. So what you said here, I found really interesting, is that there might be like times where different to kind of explore different parts of yourself. So I know like we've had like a discussion before outside of our interviews where we talked about like there might be more introverted and more extroverted periods of our lives, and how it's helpful to maybe go through different phases, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like when we think about like individuation, as we talked about before, like integration and all of these different ways of like holistic kind of growth and development, sometimes because maybe of our like very instant gratification culture, we think it has to be everything all at once rather than across a capsule of time, you know? So it's like, it's okay sometimes to be one thing 1 minute and another thing and next. It's like being integrated within yourself doesn't mean you have to go through all the different modalities in the space of one day. Like loosening up your sense of time and flattening it out a bit can kind of allow one to kind of recognize and actually pat oneself on the back for the times when we've gone for a year of needing to be within a certain cognitive pattern, which is entirely proportionate to the context, you know? And then when another context presents itself next year, we adapt in that way. But it's really just about keeping ourselves fluid enough to do these things and to adjust ourselves proportionately. You definitely don't need to be everything all at once, but you just, yeah.
How do you know what to do next? So like if it's not everything all at once, like how do you know what should I be working on next?
A lot of this kind of like comes from having an environment which gives us prompts, you know, because in the same way as like things are connected in the ways we've talked about, so is the internal with the external. The internal is reliant upon the external as a feedback system, as the external is reliant upon the internal as a feedback system. So when we're given these different prompts from life, that gives us a means to kind of say, is this proportionate? Is this proportionate? You know, it's like, and life has a lot of different kind of streams of information, lots of different kinds of streams of information. Like even a person with the most simplified, stripped down life possible will still have room for lots of different modalities in order to adjust to the life more proportionately. And so we can definitely just like keep ourselves like nice and fluid and mindful in our everyday existences without needing to undertake ridiculously strong challenges or world adventures or anything like that. But that also just enables us to better adapt to things that we don't necessarily see coming.
Interesting. Yeah. So what I find interesting is like you say that this is an integrated system, not just within yourself, but also outside of yourself as well. Like we are getting prompts from the environment, like the environment kind of informs us, or context informs us what we would like to work on next. But you're saying it's also the other way around too.
Yeah, exactly. Because like we rely, because a lot of kind of what is internal fuels what is external, if that makes sense. Like if we are getting a reaction from another person, that person is giving us a window into their inner world, if that makes sense. So it's like, it is definitely a two-way street.
Interesting. Perhaps can you give us like an example of that, like this kind of like that feedback loop, internal and external, either from someone you know or from yourself?
Absolutely. So like, I mean, let's just say like a hypothetical, for example, like let's say I have to suddenly kind of write a script, for example, for a video. Maybe I lost track of time and I realized, oh, actually, I've got to write a script now. Like maybe, you know, it sort of came at me a little bit. I'm sort of like, well, first of all, that's just giving me a prompt that I wasn't necessarily thinking proportionately. I wasn't reacting proportionately because this thing's taken me by surprise when this is a part of my everyday kind of like cycles, if that makes sense. So that tells me, oh, I got distracted by this thing. Maybe I should have concentrated more on this thing, and prioritization kind of feedback, if that makes sense. Yeah. And then I go into the thing and then I get a prompt saying, oh, maybe my internal world isn't necessarily well suited to this exercise. How do I put myself in that internal world? Okay, how about I just stop thinking, stop using words, and actually go into my lower brain, go into the feeling itself, and then work from that instead, and do a bit of like a rewiring, and then say, okay, and now let's slow down as well. Now I'm ready to do this because I've put myself into a different state of mind as well. So like that's like one way like an external prompt might happen. And then like an internal prompt, for example, might be kind of like a prompt that's, well, that was an example of kind of like that external giving me an internal. But then like, let's say I was interacting with someone and then like, let's say we had a disagreement or something of that kind of like ilk. Maybe kind of like that disagreement kind of allowed me to infer there was something going on with them if that makes sense. So it's kind of like it was a kind of a prompt into what was happening on their end. And then I was like, oh yeah, they said this recently. The context of their life is currently this, and that means they're responding to me in this context. And that means obviously their reaction is going to be out of sync with their usual behavior, if that makes sense. So
Right.
like, yeah, there's different ways we can be prompted and prompted into others too.
And when you're talking about your process, I notice like how much you're doing that, the metacognition, you're thinking about like what you're thinking. But it's like really, what's really interesting about it's also like when you're stepping back too, you can make that decision of, oh, maybe something I can do is to think less as well.
Exactly. That's the thing. Like people say like, I think the word thinking is overused and overrated because it implies it's kind of like this very specific form of thought, which uses a monologue of some sort. When there's many different ways to think, there's many different ways to process information. So it's like when people think thinking to think, they say like they must be imagining, oh yes, I'm doing this right now, and I'm doing this, and I'm putting it into these categories, blah blah blah. When in reality, like thinking about thinking could just be being mindful of these different things without needing to give them words. You inherently understand within the language of your own system what they are, and we don't always need to use words to describe them. We can just feel into them. There's a musicality within the body and outside the body, which doesn't need words all the time, but it's still a language.
Yeah, I definitely felt that recently with writing. So I've been feeling rather stuck with my writing because I think what was happening is I was writing from my head. And so every line, it took forever to write. But when I realized, oh, maybe I could trust my heart and write from the heart. And suddenly the writing became so much easier. And the writing was like meaningful too. Yeah.
That's it. It flows out, doesn't it? Because there's this kind of this thing that got stuck in the vein, and we're trying to solve that issue with words. And sometimes that's not what we need to loosen a valve. There are other ways to loosen that valve, and then we'll think in a way that we were before. But sometimes we just have to go into different modalities and different ways of being in order to unlock the part that we want to use, rather than using the part that we want to use when it's locked. Trying to unlock a part of our brain when itself is locked, using that part of the brain which is locked to unlock itself. Sometimes it's very counterproductive to do that.
Right. Like, I guess it's not really, as you said, it's not so much thinking about thinking, right? It's like sometimes that would just be analysis by paralysis, but it's like really stepping back and becoming aware and kind of like seeing what's a different modality that I could use here.
Exactly. And trusting the language of this system that we are as human beings. Like this entire kind of, in this instance, English language, it's very neocortical, it's very kind of up here, but there's a lot more kind of matter within our bodies than just this very thin part of this kind of crust that engages these kind of like these very semantic and precise language processes. That, in many ways, you can even argue are more adept at communicating to other people than they are with ourselves. But, that's a nice little devil's advocate kind of thing to say.
Okay, can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so it's just an idea I'm kind of playing with and have been playing with for a while. That there's a way to kind of understand, our own system without using words to describe it. And when we try and start imposing words, we can actually lock it up because that's not the language that our system is using to communicate with itself. We're imposing an additional task onto our operating system when it was already perfectly well suited to deal with it in its own way. And tapping into that kind of language and feeling into it and trusting it without it using words can allow for a much more harmonious relationship with it.
Interesting. Yeah. And I definitely feel like I've had that kind of experience before. Like it seems like language is like the most sophisticated modality out there, and that might be the problem. Like sometimes, like when there's like too much academia, then what we're looking for is like a sense of like a balance, right? So the
balance.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, words are so fantastic for communicating with others. So fantastic for like understanding ourselves using a framework as well. Like, as I've created a framework that allows us to understand each other better. There's a big role the top-down approach, plays, going from the neocortex into the limbic system. But there's also a big part that the bottom-up approach plays as well, which is going from the body and up into the neocortex. So yeah, like both of them have their own part to play. But I do suspect that a lot of us maybe are increasingly undervaluing the non-semantic part of our own language.
I know like we both like run our own channels, right? And a conversation outside of these interviews, we kind of talk about like it's important at times to provide ourselves space to like sometimes the body, like there's something within us calling us, oh, we should, it's not time to produce right now. But then there's like an expectation in terms of creativity to always produce.
That is like the modern like trap in many ways. This kind of like this like idea that we need to be these constant production chains, and every product needs to be, have a certain frequency as well. And the also, I think, the fallacious thought that a high frequency kind of content is going to produce kind of like more produce than a low frequency one. When in so many ways there's much more like quality over quantity emphasis we can take as creators to kind of like just suddenly allow ourselves to take time out, allow ourselves kind of breathing space, allow us to kind of like research new things, socialize, look after ourselves, etc. And it's not like we're not going to be thinking about things. We're definitely going to be thinking about things, but those times out can give us much more impact when we come back, if that makes sense. And furthermore, looking after your own mental health as a creator, like you might find someone in the space of 2 years puts out like 100 videos or something like that, or much more. And then, but what happens after the 2 years? They burn out. But then if you have someone maybe releasing, I don't know, 50 videos in that same space of time, or 25 videos in that same space of time, but they're lasting 10 years, well, they've put out more content overall. And that content will be better a lot of the time because they've had time to think about it too.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of pressure put on people to kind of stay relevant all the time. And the way these social media algorithms are constructed is to stay relevant. Like, as nice as that was theoretically, and as good it would be with a system that could actually accommodate it, the current systems that we have at the moment do make people less relevant if they don't fall in line with that production chain, that's imposed upon us. But that it isn't necessary. And ultimately, I don't think it's going to be advantageous for platforms like YouTube, for example, to drive that necessity, because you're losing out like I argue, a lot of viral potential and a lot of kind of like creative potential as well. And you're going to lose a lot of creators along the line because I think creative burnout is becoming more of a problem rather than less of one.
Interesting. So, yeah. As you talk about as a way to understand ourselves individually, to also look at the broader context, and we're living in a time which is focused on this idea that we always need to be productive and focused on something. Like it's very very forebrain kind of energy.
Exactly. And it creates that sense of urgency. Like we were talking like before, like what was in this video and the one before it, like about the way that we can become trapped, the way we can become stuck in a certain cycle. And we don't give ourselves time to think because the entire, like maybe you can argue the entire system we're surrounded with isn't giving us that sense of kind of like relief that we could benefit from affording ourselves. Rather, it's imposing a sense of urgency. It's saying that you can get this right away. Just click right now. It's immediately there. We're programmed in many ways to sort of think there is no space, there is no buffer time. We don't have to load images anymore. This isn't 2001. It's images are instantaneous. Things are given to us instantaneous, and people put out content almost instantaneously too. So almost that tricks the brain into thinking that's how things are, that's how things operate. If everything's instantaneous, so should my reaction be. And that can kind of dissuade people from metacognition in many ways.
Right. So just like an aspect of stepping back, kind of like at a societal level, to step back and take a look at what we're doing collectively.
Yeah. And I recognize that kind of like, I've become trapped in these ways, but, it's not because we're bad people. It's not because, and again, like the system is not because it's a bad system. It's chicken or the egg. Does the system create the people or the people create the system? That whole cycle. But it's just becoming mindful of not just yourself as a system, but also the system you're within as a system. And just like doing the Russian doll with the entire thing and expanding outwards and then contracting inwards into the microprocesses, and just be aware of what we can control. And we can control how much time we take to act, how much time we take to think. And so if we start from there, maybe that will have a bigger impact upon society too. Because if society does start with people, then maybe people slowing down will slow society down a bit.
Yeah, I can really appreciate how you are approaching this from a non-judgmental perspective and not trying to like, it's not like kind of like finding who the bad guy is around here, but it's like,
No,
yeah,
no.
this is maybe just like like how society, just like a person, we have times where we might have some sort of imbalance in some sort of way, and different times of our
That's the
lives, just like
thing.
different
Yeah.
times in society where there's different kinds of imbalances that are going on.
Exactly. And sometimes society might behave in a way that's proportionate to the crisis, and other times
Right.
it won't. Like sometimes it'll impose austerity in the middle of a recession. How would you call that proportionate? So it's like there are certain things that we do as a society that aren't very proportionate either. But there are other times when it's definitely the right time to vote in a certain person or what have you. So there's a lot of proportionality there too. But yeah, just
Yeah.
being mindful that everything is a system of some sort, and the system is informed from both the top up and the bottom down.
Right.
If that makes
It's
sense.
all
So yeah,
it's all interconnected. And
yeah,
so what I see is like sometimes we think, oh, we must be like kind of trapped in this system of like imbalances. There's no way out of it. But it's just really how things are right now, either at an individual level or at a societal level, and things are bound to change, and we could trust
yeah,
that there's a way of operating outside of the current way. For example, like
yeah,
as you were saying, you could like gaining that sense of trust that if you're not always focused on something, you can be productive because you're integrating the things. Like if you step away from that thing, you're still having that in the back of your mind, and you're integrating everything else that you're doing in the meantime back to what you've been originally doing.
100%. I mean, that's what I did recently. Like I took out like 2 months upwards, like away from YouTube, just to kind of May and June, and it was so good for me, and it was so good for the channel, and ultimately it'll be good for the audience too because it's going to be better content. I did a lot of good work then, but it was a lot of internal work or only immediately external work. And sometimes that's what's necessary. Sometimes it's necessary to work on the foundations. Other times it's necessary to work on the, superstructure above the foundations. But both of them need work. We just got to cycle in between them.
Yeah. I think it's good for people to hear that just as a creator, like what you're working on personally, because I think that amount of vulnerability helps other people too, because they think that personal side is always like
That's it.
hidden away.
This is it. You see, this is how like these systems are kind of like isolated and thus like becoming entropic in some ways, because like you have like a creator who feels like really pushed by their audience, who want a high frequency of content to like push out this kind of like this really larger than life image or this amazing amount of content. Look at how productive I am, because that's what they feel the audience is demanding. And then the
Right.
audience, though, are informed by that, and not only are they told, oh, creators can do this is healthy, but they're also told, I should be more like that. Why am I not that productive? This person I'm looking up to is all like this. That means their own kind of demand for content can actually cycle back and impact them negatively, just as a
Right.
creator's own kind of need to put out content can cycle back, inform the audience, condition the audience to the high frequency, and then it's like, oh, I'm trapped now, essentially, in that cycle. So it's like it's just a good kind of way to be mindful of both the system on one end and the system on the other end, and see how these two parts of the system are informing each other.
Yeah. So you're talking about like flow at this greater level, right? So
Yeah,
beyond
it's all
like just like typology itself, how we are all influencing each other too.
exactly. That's the beautiful thing. Like typology isn't just about kind of like understanding the individual, it's also understanding kind of like the people who are shaping that individual and the way they are being shaped by that individual. Like everyone's part of their own human like system, and sometimes for a person's personal growth they have to go out of the human system that they're within, because maybe growth isn't possible to a certain point until they are outside of that system. So it's like it's also recognized that kind of we are in these systems, but sometimes we don't need to be in those systems either, and other times we can change the systems, and it's better to change the system. So there's lots of proportionality involved and lots of kind of like different ways we can approach things, but just like giving ourselves a space to think can allow us to kind of be mindful of our own systems and also external systems that we
Yeah.
are a part of. Yeah.
Yeah. You're saying it's like it's not about like placing blame or judgment. It's just really stepping back and becoming like aware and looking at everything kind of like from a distance. Harry, really happy to have you on my show. Can you tell us like how can we look for your content?
Yeah, absolutely. So I only like I actually run two different YouTube channels. I'm not really doing a lot with the music one, but the music one's just under my name, Harry Murrell. And if you type in Harry Murrell on YouTube, you just get that channel. It's the oldest channel I have. I made it in like 2009, and I put up like guitar covers and stuff, just like nice, relaxing stuff. And then like if you want to hear me talk more about stuff like this, but from a more kind of like typological kind of psychological perspective, I have a channel called Cognitive Personality Theory. And there, you'll see lots of videos explaining and breaking down my system, as well as the underlying kind of philosophy, like what we talked about, that's imbued within the system, as well as kind of like, links to kind of like, services I offer, such as typing and coaching, on top of everything else too.
Excellent. So I'll link to those things down below in the description box. Thank you for being on the show.
It's been a pleasure, Leon.